Please beware, this is one of the most gruesome cases we've ever covered on this channel. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, November 24th, 1998, in the quiet Finnish town of Hyvinkää, a man drove out to the Capula landfill to drop off his trash. But as he dumped his bags onto a newly arrived mound of waste, something strange caught his eye. It looked like a mannequin's leg, pale, rigid, half buried in the snow-dusted garbage. He stepped closer, then he stopped cold. Because it wasn't plastic, it wasn't fake, it was a real human leg. The man backed away, shaking, and he called the authorities immediately. Within the hour, police and forensic pathologists had arrived at the site. The landfill was sealed off. The body part was carefully lifted from the waste and examined under the cold gray sky. The leg was intact, skin, muscle, bone, leg hair still visible. The signs were clear. Someone had been killed. But who? There was no torso, no hands, no face, and no identification. Just a single severed limb left to rot among discarded furniture, broken glass, and food wrappers. The landfill didn't just serve Hyvinkää. It received garbage from more than 1 million people in the region. For investigators, the possibilities were endless and utterly overwhelming. So they started digging. And what they found next was so disturbing, so beyond anything the country had seen before, that the Finnish government sealed the entire case from the public. Sealed it until the year 2038, because even in a country known for peace and order, no one was prepared for what came out of that apartment in Hyvinkää. Not the police, not the press, and not the people. And once you hear what really happened, you'll understand why. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. It was just past midday on November 24th, 1998, when a man pulled up to the Capula landfill on the outskirts of Hyvinkää and saw the horrible scene. Forensic pathologists had determined that it belonged to an adult, almost certainly male. But that landfill wasn't just Hyvinkää's backyard. It served over 1 million residents across southern Finland. The leg could have come from anywhere. So the police did the only thing they could. They started digging. They brought in cadaver dogs trained to sniff out the faintest trace of human remains and enlisted students from the National Police Academy to sift through the garbage, bucket by frozen bucket. A local military garrison even stepped in to guard the perimeter overnight, ensuring no tampering, no press intrusion, no contamination. It was winter, and the snow kept falling. Garbage froze in place. Rot and ice fused together. It was slow and grueling. Still, they searched. Then, 1 week later, they found it, a small, unrecognizable piece of flesh. At first glance, no one could tell what it was. Just a shredded chunk of tissue. But lab results confirmed it, a section of the human stomach. From the same body, from the same victim. It was barely anything, but it was enough to begin painting a picture. Because when they analyzed that tissue, they found more than just DNA. They found a timeline, they found a lifestyle, and they found a clue no one expected. The rest of the body was gone. The killer had made sure of that. But the stomach held secrets, and it would tell police exactly what kind of life this person had lived and how he may have died. Lab technicians analyzed its composition, looking for anything. Disease markers, traces of toxins, or indicators of time of death. But what they found first was alcohol, high levels of it. Enough to confirm that the victim had been heavily intoxicated at the time he died. That alone didn't tell the whole story, but the tissue also showed long-term damage, signs of chronic consumption. This wasn't someone who drank occasionally. This was someone who drank daily, possibly someone dependent. And that mattered because it gave investigators something to work with. They knew now they were looking for a young adult, most likely male, between 20 and 30 years old. Someone with a serious alcohol problem. Someone likely struggling, and most importantly, someone who might have been living on the margins of society. In Finland, people facing that kind of hardship often relied on state assistance, so detectives turned to welfare records. They pulled names from the system, anyone who hadn't shown up to collect their monthly support, and then they started making calls. Most were accounted for, some had moved, some were in rehab, some had recently re-entered the workforce. But then, one name stood out. a 23-year-old man from the nearby town of Hyvinkää. He hasn't claimed his last 2 payments, no medical records, no reported hospital stays, no travel, no notice to his landlord, and most telling, no missing persons report. No one had noticed he was gone, so officers drove to his listed address. It was a small flat in a quiet apartment block. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox was full, and the neighbors hadn't seen him in weeks. Inside, police found nothing alarming. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no mess, but also no life. His fridge was empty, his bed untouched. It looked like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Then came the DNA test. The results confirmed it. This man, unnamed to the public, was the one whose leg had been found at the landfill. He was the one whose stomach had told the story. He'd lived alone, he rarely left his apartment. He didn't have many friends, and his family, if they were still in contact at all, hadn't raised the alarm. He hadn't just died alone, he had vanished alone. And yet, as police dug deeper, they found that in the final days of his life, he hadn't been alone at all, in fact, the last time anyone saw him alive. He was in the company of 4 others, and every single one of them would soon be under arrest, because he hadn't just disappeared, he'd crossed paths with the wrong crowd. But in the final hours before his death, he was surrounded by people, not strangers, people he knew, people he considered friends, and that's what made what happened next so difficult to comprehend. There were 5 of them that night. First, there was Jarno Elg. He was 23 years old, born and raised in Hyvinkää, and from an early age, his life had spiraled. He struggled with mental illness, had a long history of substance abuse, and had been institutionalized multiple times. He didn't finish school, he didn't hold a job, and when he was 16, he tried to burn down a medieval church, an act inspired by the black metal movement that had swept through Scandinavia in the early 90s. He was arrested for arson and spent nearly 2 years in juvenile detention. By the time he met the others, he wasn't just isolated. He had come to see himself as something more, a teacher, a guide, a kind of self-made prophet. And at the center of his beliefs was Satanism, not worship in the traditional sense, but a personal philosophy of power, dominance, and absolute freedom from moral restraint. Then there was Terhi Johanna Tervashanka. She was just 17, a runaway, estranged from her family. She had started drinking in the 9th grade and quickly descended into addiction. She'd also been hospitalized for psychiatric care, and like Elgi, had spent time at Kelikoski Hospital. That's where they met, and from the moment they connected, she followed him, not just physically, mentally, emotionally. She absorbed his worldview and helped create the insulated echo chamber they would both live in. Next was Mika Kristianriska, 21 years old, quiet, withdrawn, also from the mental health system. He had minor offenses on his record, mostly drunken disturbances and vandalism, but nothing violent. He too had met Elg during treatment, and he too found something magnetic in Elg's presence. Elg didn't just talk about pain and power, he believed in it. Mika followed. Then came the youngest, a 16-year-old boy from Kerava. His name has never been made public. He was vulnerable, disconnected from family, and like the others, pulled into Elgi's orbit. And finally, the victim. He didn't dress like them, he didn't share their beliefs, but for reasons still unclear, he ended up in their company. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he felt accepted, or maybe he had no idea what they were truly capable of. But that night, he was with them. All 5 were dressed in black, all were heavily intoxicated, and all of them were wandering through the streets of Hyvinkää on a cold Saturday evening, November 21st, 1998. That's when they came across a group of young people standing outside a Pentecostal church. The church's youth group had launched an outreach effort to help teens struggling with alcohol. They were handing out tea, offering conversation, and hoping to make a difference in a town where youth drinking had quietly become a crisis. The 2 groups couldn't have been more different. The church group stood quietly, sober, clean-cut. The other group, led by Elg, reeked of booze and stared them down with smug defiance. And then Elg spoke out loudly and mockingly. He called Christianity a waste of time. He laughed at the idea of salvation. And he made sure they all knew. Satanism, he said, wasn't devil worship. It was freedom. It was power. And it didn't answer to anyone. For a moment, it seemed like something might happen. But eventually, Both groups drifted away. The churchgoers returned inside, and Elg and his group headed to the train station. But the confrontation had lit a fuse, because that wasn't the last debate of the night, and the next one wouldn't end with words. Back at Jarno Elg's apartment, the group slipped into a familiar rhythm. That flat, small, dark, cluttered with skull-themed decor had become their haven. Their ritual ground. The windows were closed tight. The walls were lined with tapestries and posters of black metal bands. And in the corner, LG's stereo system sat ready, and he turned it on. The Canian Chronicle by Ancient filled the room, an album Elg held sacred. He said it gave voice to everything he believed in, to darkness, to power, and to rebellion. Everyone was drinking, substances were passed around, and the atmosphere turned heavy, fueled not just by intoxication, but by Elg's brooding silence. Then came a comment that changed everything. Male A, the quiet one, the one who didn't fully belong, casually said something about the music. That it wasn't very good, and that was just noise. It wasn't meant as an attack, but Elg's eyes went cold. Without a word, he stood up and punched him hard across the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The room went silent for a moment. But then, the 16-year-old joined in, kicking the man as he tried to rise. Terhi and the boy dragged him to the sofa, where the group took turns beating him. It escalated quickly, not in a burst of rage, but in something slower, more deliberate, as though each strike fed the next, as though cruelty itself had become a shared language. Elg left the room briefly, and when he returned, he wasn't holding a weapon, but something symbolic. A studded dog collar and a metal leash. They forced male A onto all fours, fastened the collar around his neck, and made him crawl across the room like an animal while they laughed. But it didn't stop there. They urinated on him, one by one. They caused lots of injuries on his body. He begged them to stop. He promised he wouldn't tell anyone, that he'd forget everything if they just let him go. But no one listened. If anything, his fear only seemed to enrage LG further. He grabbed a pair of scissors, walked over slowly, and without hesitation, began stabbing him in the head. Afterwards, they slumped him back onto the sofa, bleeding, dazed, broken, and debated what to do next. That's when Melee tried to escape. He made a break for the door, still bound and battered, but he didn't get far. They caught him and dragged him back inside. Elg, calm and calculated, told Terhi to fetch something. She returned with a roll of duct tape. Together, they tied his wrists and ankles, binding him so tightly he couldn't move. Then, to keep him from screaming any further, they wrapped the tape around his head, covering his mouth, and unknowingly, his nose. He couldn't scream anymore, but he also couldn't breathe. Still, the group continued, beating him, taunting him, hurting him, unaware that he was dying beneath the tape. And by the time they noticed he had stopped moving, it was already too late. He was silent, and he was gone. But that didn't end it, because what they did next was even worse. Jarno Elg took out a knife, and Terhi fetched a pair of scissors, and together they began cutting open the body. This wasn't cleanup, this was butchery. Then came the head. It was cut off and tossed between them, passed from one hand to another. At one point, they laughed so hard they dropped it. The apartment had descended into something beyond cruelty, beyond madness. Then, Elg and Terhi sat down and ate him. They carved pieces from his body and consumed them. Not out of desperation, not for ritual, just because they could, and Mika joined in. Later in the night, someone, possibly Elg, gouged out Male A's eyes. And then, in what can only be described as a final act of desecration, they inserted firecrackers into the empty sockets. They lit them. And when they did, the skull exploded. The laughter didn't stop. The music never turned down. And the line between reality and nightmare had long been erased. By dawn, the high began to fade. The group sobered up, just enough to register the blood on the walls, the parts of a body scattered across the floor. But something was missing. The head. They searched the apartment, confused, checking closets and cupboards. Then someone opened a cabinet door, and there it was. Someone had stashed the head away during the night and forgotten. They thought it was hilarious. They found it funny that they could lose a head and not even realize it. But the cleanup hadn't started yet, because what came next was disposal. The apartment didn't smell like death. It reeked of bleach, stale beer, and blood that had soaked into the floors. By morning, Terhi Tervashenko was on her knees, scrubbing the wooden panels beneath the sofa. Jarno Elg hadn't stopped sawing. While she scrubbed, he was still in the bathroom, hunched over what was left of male A, using a dull blade to break bone and sever flesh into smaller, more manageable pieces. Blood had splattered across the ceiling, clung to the walls, and puddled in the tile grooves. No room was clean. The entire apartment was a crime scene, top to bottom. But they weren't professionals. They weren't even trying to make sense of the horror they'd just committed. They were just reacting. Mika Riska and the 16-year-old boy had stepped outside. They'd walked into the cold morning air, maybe trying to escape the smell, maybe trying to clear their heads. And as they paced the streets of Hyvinkää, they made a decision. They'd scatter the body, cut it up, bag it, dump it piece by piece, bin by bin. Back at the apartment, Terhi was now scrubbing blood off the walls with what looked like a kitchen rag. Elg, still energized, kept cutting, and eventually black trash bags were pulled out. The group stuffed male A's arms, legs, organs, and fragments of tissue into the plastic. They tied the bags tight and sealed them with duct tape. Dumpster after dumpster across the suburbs of Hyvinkää received their share. Bits of flesh, a partial torso, pieces of someone who, just days earlier, had been a living, breathing man. But the head, they kept. For reasons never fully explained, they stored it in a cupboard, like it was nothing more than leftovers from a night they never planned to repeat. Then they waited. Over the next few days, Elg and Terhi stayed glued to the TV. They flipped through channels, watched the local news, and laughed when the landfill story finally broke. A leg had been found, and they were thrilled. As the headlines flashed across the screen, and journalists speculated about the mystery limb, the killers sat in that blood-stained flat, smirking, high, and untouchable. But the landfill wasn't done giving up its secrets, and neither was Elg, because he couldn't stop himself from watching or from talking. And very soon, someone would talk back. As the police continued their investigation about who the victims spent a lot of time with, the name Jarno Elg came up more than once. Witnesses said Elg often wandered the streets with a small group. They wore all black, kept to themselves, and drank hard. The 23-year-old victim, let's call him Male A, had been seen with them just days before he vanished. On December 8, 1998, police made their move. 4 people were arrested: Jarno Sebastian Elg, age 23, Mika Riska, age 21, Terhi Tervashenko, age 17, and the 16-year-old boy, whose name remained sealed by law. All were taken into custody, and the first place police searched was Elg's apartment. Inside the flat, investigators were hit with the smell first, then the visuals. At first glance, it looked like the home of a Gothic collector or a horror film fan. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't decoration. There were skull-shaped pendants, books about Satanism, a golden necklace etched with 666, and handwritten notes referencing the Satanic Bible. Knives with ornate handles were tucked behind furniture. Symbols were scratched into the woodwork. The entire apartment felt like a shrine to chaos. But that wasn't what shook the officers most. It was the DNA. Blood spatter had dried behind furniture, clung to the ceiling, and pooled beneath the floorboards. There were strands of human hair caught in the baseboards, and samples of skin stuck to dried patches on the bathroom wall. The evidence was overwhelming, biological, physical, and undeniable. So much so that some investigators began asking themselves, was this the only one? Could there be other victims? Was this just the crime they got caught for? Because the apartment didn't look like a one-time scene. It looked like a ritual site, used, stained, and lived in. But just as questions began to multiply, the suspects began to talk. And what they confessed next, no one was prepared to hear. The courtroom was silent when Jarno Sebastian Elg entered. But it wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect. It was the kind that followed disbelief. He walked in smirking, his hair long and unkempt, his frame thin but firm. And as he sat down, surrounded by lawyers and press, he raised both hands and threw up metal horns. For Elg, this was a stage, and he was performing. From the moment questioning began, he showed no remorse. In fact, he leaned into the horror. He told the court the murder wasn't senseless, according to him. It followed a strict code, a satanic code. And he listed the rules one by one. Don't give your opinion unless it's asked for. When in someone's lair, show them respect. If a guest in your home annoys you, show no mercy. Male A, Elg claimed, had broken all three. He insulted the music, he disrespected the space, and that, according to Elg, justified what came next. The court also heard about something else. Something Elg had done just weeks before the murder when no one was watching. He had tied his dog to a radiator in his apartment, then beat it slowly to death with a metal pipe. Investigators later described it as a rehearsal, proof that Elg had been testing his capacity for cruelty and finding that it didn't bother him at all. It was a brief moment in the trial, but it changed the mood in the room. Because this wasn't about a drunken night gone wrong, it was about someone who had crossed a line long before he killed a man. The courtroom was already closed to the public. No cameras, no journalists. Only selected plea portions were made public. Everything else was sealed by the Finnish government. The brutality was simply too much, and the satanic panic at the time had reached such a height that officials feared widespread backlash if the full case were released. Still, some facts were made known, and so were the sentences. Jarno Elg was sentenced to life in prison. But in Finland, life didn't mean forever. He became eligible for parole after just 12 years. Terhi, only 17 at the time, was deemed partially insane. Psychiatric evaluation said she knew right from wrong, but her mental state was compromised. She was given 8.5 years. Mika Riska, who had helped torture the victim, helped dismember him, and took part in cannibalism, was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months. He was found guilty of assault, necrophilia, and improper disposal of a corpse. The 16-year-old boy, the youngest in the group, was released. The court ruled that he had been manipulated and coerced by the older members. His name was sealed permanently. After the sentencing, Finnish authorities made an unprecedented decision. The full case file would be sealed for 40 years. Until 2038, no one would know the victim's name. No public access to crime scene photos, no access to interrogation recordings, no trial transcripts beyond the sentencing phase. They said it was to protect the public, but others believed it was to protect Finland's sense of itself. Because what happened in that flat wasn't just murder, it was something darker. A ritual, a breakdown, and a warning. And despite the verdict, this wasn't the end. Not for Elg, not for Terhi, and not for the families that would soon cross their paths again. Jarno Sebastian Elg walked out of prison in 2016. He had served 17 years, just 5 more than the minimum required for life. In prison, he had completed several educational programs. He took courses, passed exams, and even started working full-time inside the system. So when parole was granted, officials said he had shown rehabilitative progress. But outside, things didn't stay quiet for long. He got into a bar fight while on supervised parole. He was intoxicated, loud, and uncooperative. The incident cost him his early privileges, but it wasn't enough to revoke parole entirely. Since then, he has remained off the radar, no new charges and no new arrests, just a man who left prison and disappeared into the background of Finnish society. However, Terhi Johanna Tervashanka's path was very different. She had been paroled in 2003 after serving barely 5 years. She was young, unstable, and diagnosed with partial insanity, and 4 years later, she snapped again. In 2007, she stabbed a 47-year-old man with a billhook, a curved blade used for cutting tree limbs. The blow was brutal, deliberate, and fatal. This time, there was no debate about her sanity. She was sentenced to another 10 years in prison. While incarcerated, she escaped in 2011. It wasn't a dramatic breakout, just a silent disappearance during a supervised release program. But the public backlash was swift. Authorities caught her days later. She had been smuggling, falsifying prescriptions, and forging ID documents under a false name. Eventually, she served her full sentence. And when she walked out again, she was older, she now lives in northern Finland, reportedly has a child, and has not been convicted of any new crimes since. But what's never changed is her silence about what happened that night in 1998. She never named the victim, never spoke of remorse. Only once, in an old interview, she claimed the death was an accident and that he had just been tied up and things went too far. So, what do you think about this case? We want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one of them, and if you found this case as disturbing and compelling as we did, Don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe for more real true crime stories like this. There are more cases out there, buried, sealed, or silenced, and we're here to tell them.